Hola a todos y todas, mi nombre es Emilio Maldonado, fundador de la red Pride Connection Chile, y quiero darles la bienvenida a nuestra charla junto a la economista Lee Badgett, con quien conversaremos sobre el costo de la exclusión LGBT+, no solo en las economías, sino también en las organizaciones y en la sociedad en su conjunto. Antes de continuar y presentarles a nuestra tremenda invitada, quiero darle la bienvenida a todas las personas que se están conectando desde distintas partes de América Latina. Si bien este webinar lo estamos organizando desde Chile con motivo de nuestro cuarto aniversario como red de empresas, quiero contarles que Pride Connection es una alianza entre empresas única en América Latina y que promueve que los espacios laborales sean inclusivos para todos y todas, sin importar la orientación sexual, ni identidad o expresión de género. Todo talento debe ser bienvenido. Y por primera vez hemos organizado un webinar abierto a todos los capítulos de Pride Connection en nuestra región: México, Costa Rica, Panamá, Colombia, Perú, Argentina, Brasil y recientemente Uruguay y Ecuador se han sumado a esta red de empresas y están unidos esta mañana, como también personas de otros países de nuestro continente. Para todos ustedes, un abrazo a la distancia. Además, quiero contarles que luego de la conversación o de la charla de Lee Badgett, vamos a abrir el espacio para preguntas, las cuales podrán hacer de dos formas: por medio del chat, acá abajo en su pantalla, en la plataforma Zoom, y para ello, quienes quieran hacerlo a través del chat, les pedimos que se identifiquen con su nombre y país, o levantando la mano, que también es un icono que aparece en sus pantallas, y si eligen esta última opción, para quienes no están familiarizados o familiarizadas con Zoom, estarán pidiendo encender su cámara y su micrófono, es decir, harán las preguntas en vivo. Y en honor, por supuesto, a nuestra invitada, y como fuera anunciado, vamos a cambiar inglés para avanzar en nuestra conversación y aprender de esta experta de clase mundial. So, already we can see our special guest on the screen. And when we invited Lee to be a speaker at this webinar, we couldn't imagine the massive interest it will spark. Lee just published her latest book, The Economic Case for LGBT Equality and Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits all of us. Quick note, you can find this book on Amazon, so you can find it here. And when you read this book, you can understand why so many of you are connected from each corner of Latam, from the very north in Mexico to the south in Patagonia. And on a personal note, and I hope you share this with me if you read this book, the book makes pretty clear the impact of leaving aside an important segment of the population, such as the LGBT+ community. How much workforce are we wasting by not having the right environment for everyone to feel welcome? In a post-pandemic world, when we are rethinking the new economy and the way we were used to work, this text is a personal, this is a personal opinion, of course, is a beacon of hope in the new normality. And after the amount of evidence included in this book, and when you see that in the bottom line, a country can add at least 1% to their annual GDP, it seems incredible, really incredible, that businesses, societies, and the whole economy are up to exclude LGBT+ community from schools, from the health system, and from a good workplace. So if you are in this webinar and you're an ally in the corporate world, this conversation will help you to have the tools to convince others about the need of LGBT inclusion in every space of our lives. So, being said that, let me introduce you to the economist, researcher, professor, and worldwide speaker, Lee Badgett. Maybe I should add a proud married lesbian and a charismatic expert on this matter. Lee, I can say you now, thank you so much for being today with us. We can see hundreds of people connected right now, and we are thrilled, really thrilled to hear you and talk to you about your findings in your book and in your career. Lee, again, the cyberspace is all yours.
Buenos días y gracias. I'm very happy to be here and to spend what is a glorious late summer day here in North America with you all. And let me just share my screen. I have a few visuals here. Hopefully that's coming through okay. I am very excited to be able to talk to you about what is a relatively new way of thinking about a lot of questions that have circulated about LGBT people around the world. We're seeing a moment in time where economic inequality and healthcare problems have really been highlighted by the COVID crisis. And I think, as Emilio was saying, you know, what this means for us is that we have an opportunity to think about what our future will look like in a way that that addresses some of the underlying conditions that has made this so much worse for certain groups of people. And I think LGBT people are among those. So what I want to talk about today is how we get beyond thinking about LGBT issues from the perspective of the pain that stigma and discrimination and sometimes violence causes for LGBT people as individuals. And the case that I want to make is that actually there's a cost to economies as well. So when we talk about LGBT inclusion, I think we're talking about improving the economic situations of different countries, economies. When we're talking about exclusion, of course, that's the other side. That's what's holding us back, holding our economies back. And that is where we are in the world today. Every country is a developing country when it comes to thinking about LGBT issues. My argument is going to focus on the human capital, as we call it in economics, and the economic potential of people and how that's held back for LGBT people when they face exclusion in the marketplace or in different kinds of social institutions. And I'm going to focus on how that works through education, employment, and health. And then actually, and it's a very important connection to think about what businesses see when they think about LGBT inclusion. And so we will get to that. But let's start with thinking about the people on the ground, the people who are experiencing the kind of exclusion that we're talking about here. So there's a lot of numbers and data in the book, as Emilio alluded to, and we'll get to those. But there also are these human stories that I think when we take them just a little bit further, we see how they're connected. This is a picture of a young man who lives in Bhutan named Pema Dorji. When he was young and in school, he said it was an experience like going to war. This is not the experience that we want our children to have when they go to school. But what Pema and many other LGBT young people learn in school is not just math and reading and how to write, but learning that they will be targets. When he was in school, he was subjected to physical violence from his classmates, from harassment, teasing, bullying. And when he looked to his teachers for help to address that, to stop it, to make it possible for him to continue in school, he was told, it's your fault. You're doing this by how you are behaving. So when as he grew older, he realized that this had taken a toll on him that we'll get to in a second in terms of thinking about mental health in particular. But the story, I think, just gives us a sense that bullying hurts LGBT students in very real ways. What what history taken a little bit farther shows is that that has consequences for people well into their adulthood that will hold them back from what they can contribute to the economy. So let's just start with what happens in schools. When students are bullied, we see from research around the world, including some from Latin America, that they have lower grades. They're more likely to be absent from school. They're more likely to drop out of school and not finish it. And they're less likely to continue on to university. To actually get the level of education that they're capable of, that they want, and that we want them to get, because that level of education gives them skills, knowledge, and allows them to fully participate in our economies. So that's at the LGBT student level. It turns out, though, actually, that bullying is bad for schools much more broadly than that, for the individuals who are bullied. It creates an environment that is not a good way, not a good learning environment for all students. So there's international research that shows that that schools that have more bullying, actually, in those schools, the students do more poorly on standardized tests. And for example, they have lower scores on math. So bullying is reducing the quality of education and the quantity of education, not just for LGBT young people, but for all young people. And we know, those of us who are economists know, that one of the most important determinants of an economy's level of health and productivity is exactly the level of education, the skills, the knowledge, that human capital that people bring to the economy. So, so in the schools, exclusion of LGBT people is holding that back. Now, what happens when people actually get to the labor market? The situation is not a whole lot better. When we do surveys of LGBT people around the world, in every country that's studied, we find many reports of discrimination. In the United States, where I live, about 1 in 5 LGBT people report experiencing discrimination at some point. In Europe, they just released a new study just a few months ago of all EU countries and found that, again, actually 1 in 5 people in the EU report employment discrimination in the past year. That's actually not changed from the study, from the first survey that the EU did in 2012, I believe it was, where again, 1 in 5 people are still experiencing discrimination. There are studies that were conducted by national statistical offices in Peru and in Ecuador that show the same thing, actually, for LGBT people, that there are common reports of discrimination. So this is something, again, we see it everywhere. It has consequences. We know from studies of several countries that have good data on LGBT people that it results in lower wages for gay and bisexual men in particular. Lesbian and bisexual women are also hurt by the fact that they're women. They actually do well compared to heterosexual women, but still earn less than straight and gay and bisexual men. We've done experiments all over the world where we test out how applicants who are LGBT fare compared to non-LGBT applicants when they apply for jobs. Again, in pretty much every study in every part of the world that's been studied so far, we find that that LGBT people are less likely to be seen as employers as applicants that they want to hire and continue to interview. So we have now decades, many studies, much evidence that discrimination exists. Now, so what's the problem with that? Well, we also know that discrimination means we're not efficiently using our workforce. So it's going to result in lower productivity, perhaps higher turnover. What that looks like from the LGBT perspective can also be seen in the fact that people stay closeted in the workplace. If they feel like they cannot be open about who they are and bring their full selves to work, it may have implications for their relationships with their supervisors, their coworkers, their customers. If they are experiencing discrimination or being steered out of jobs that they're very qualified for, that's another way that productivity will be diminished. And we see examples of this around the world. There's a lot in the book about this, of what I call walls, where there are outright bans on certain kinds of jobs. Sometimes they're more invisible fences where they look friendly. And we increasingly see workplaces around the world that seem to be more friendly for LGBT people, but often there's a limit. So I tell the story about a professional, highly trained professional in the United States who works for a large nonprofit organization, who was very out in the workplace, a gay man, very out, and had not experienced any discrimination until he got married to another man. At that point, some of his colleagues started to shun him, to not invite him to be on projects where he actually could contribute a great deal that would have benefited the organization and the project. And that, you can see, is reducing the effectiveness of the use of his skills, and it's going to reduce the effectiveness of the organization as a whole. So there are lots of ways that LGBT people will be steered out of jobs where they would be most productive. So again, what we see is exclusion that's holding back LGBT people from contributing their full potential, all of their creativity, all of their skills, all of their knowledge and experience. The last way I want to just briefly address is to think about the health implications here, because what we've learned, what my colleagues in the health side of academia have learned, is quite literally that stigma makes people sick. They call it minority stress. Everybody experiences stress in life, but if you're LGBT, you're also going to be experiencing different kinds of discrimination and stigma that will make you think twice, again, about being open to other people. So you have to hide your identity in many cases to avoid discrimination. That takes its toll on the cognitive energy that your body has to exist and to participate in different kinds of contexts. And the hypervigilance, the worrying about the fact that you might be subject to stigma and discrimination, again, can also be bad for your health. Studies have been done, again, all over the world. I know there were quite a few that have been done in Latin America that show these kinds of this kind of stress and its harmful impact. Because what happens is we see the health between LGBT people and non-LGBT people diverge. We call those health disparities. So LGBT people have higher rates of anxiety and depression, higher rates of attempts of suicide and of just thinking about suicide. They have higher rates of substance use, of violence. They are more subject to discrimination in healthcare settings. So altogether, we are put into a position where there are challenges to health that actually manifest themselves in poor physical and mental health. The good news is that we are learning that you can actually do something about that. There's a growing body of research that shows that places that are more inclusive, that have more inclusive laws and policies for LGBT people, actually do have lower healthcare disparities. So reducing stigma does seem to shrink those disparities. And the last thing that I'll note is that the health really kind of creates sort of this triangle between education, employment, and health, and its impacts on the economy. Because when you're in poorer health, you may be less likely to be able to get the education that you need. You may not be able to go to work every day. You may not even be able to participate in the labor force at all. When you are there, you're likely to be less productive. So we know that health, like education, is one of those core pieces of human capital, core parts of human capital that really are what make our economies run and run well. And when there's less health and less education and knowledge, they do not run as well. So that is the cost to economies, thinking about it from the perspective of the experiences of LGBT people. Now, it turns out that many businesses have known this for a while. And so we have something that's called the business case for LGBT equality, not just the economic case, which I think of as being broader. But for a long time, businesses have been thinking about these issues and have been taking actions to to try to make changes. So some of those changes are being made at the employer level with regard to policies, HR policies, benefits policies. Others are being done at the more public level. So the names of those multinational companies that were just flashing on the screen, and this quote actually comes from a friend of the court brief that hundreds of businesses filed in a marriage equality case back in 2013. Similar briefs have been filed since then, making basically the same point. And this is at the heart of the business case, which is that in thinking about the discriminatory laws, but also just the treatment of LGBT people poorly can impede business efforts to recruit, hire, and retain the best workers. Okay, so those are the places where you need to find the best workers and put them in an environment that enables them to perform at their best. So this is taking that economic case and thinking about it from the business perspective. It turns out the businesses know what they're talking about, right? So we do have, again, a growing body of research that shows that from the LGBT person's perspective, that when they are working in a place that's more supportive of them, where the climate is more inclusive, that there are economic benefits for their employers. So this is just a summary, really, of a bunch of different studies that we found when we dug into this question a few years back. And we find that that inclusion is linked to greater job commitment, better health outcomes, as we talked about, increased job satisfaction, and more openness about being LGBT in the workplace, which comes with those health benefits as well as the economic benefits for their employers. When we compare across employers, which several recent studies have done, we find that employers that have more inclusive policies also do better in the marketplace. They have higher stock prices, higher profits, higher productivity, and there's at least some evidence that they're able to attract a more creative workplace. So employers are seeing what those benefits are, and increasingly in the United States and in some other places that we can see, like when marriage equality questions came up for voters in Ireland and Taiwan and in Australia, businesses who were on the front lines kind of saying, yes, this is a good idea. We want marriage equality. States in the United States that have pulled back on policies or made them worse, actually, for LGBT people. Actually, like my own home state of North Carolina, passed a law that basically required discrimination against transgender people. And businesses responded with their feet, literally. They said, we're not going to hold our events there. We are not going to build our new plants there. We are not going to relocate employees in your state because it requires discrimination against LGBT people. Now that is something that hurt a lot of heterosexual people who lost the jobs that they would have had otherwise, to the tune of about $4 billion in potential business and investment in that state. So businesses are increasingly thinking about this not just from their own perspective, where they clearly have something to gain, but also thinking about taking that message to the broader world. The last thing I'll say is that, not surprisingly, when you add up these effects, there's this larger effect on the economy that is measurable. And Amelia mentioned the 1% number. So there have been studies in India and the Philippines, Kenya, and South Africa. I did 2 of those, other people did the others, that showed that if you add up even just a few of these kinds of effects that we can actually measure with the data that we have, thinking about employment effects and health effects mainly, we see that countries are losing somewhere around 1% of gross domestic product, GDP, not GPD, sorry about that. 1%. Let's talk about that number for a second, because it sounds kind of small, right? Especially as we are going through this very massive economic downturn because of the COVID crisis. So 1% doesn't sound very large in that kind of context, but that's actually a meaningful number in terms of thinking about recessions. So in a sense, we are putting ourselves in a permanent recession, a structural recession, by how we are treating LGBT people, even before we get to the devastating effects of COVID or other kinds of economic crises that we've experienced. from time to time. If we thought about this at the global level, 1% is basically the size of the Turkish economy or the Dutch economy. So these are not, it's not a small number really when you think about it. It has the potential to impact millions and millions of people. Finally, I'll just say this is a study that we did a few years back where we looked at emerging economies. And we said, well, here's the real test of this idea about the economic case. If countries are more inclusive, do we actually see them have higher GDP? And what we found was yes. So you can just kind of see from this little scatter plot here, where we have GDP per capita on the vertical axis and a measure of inclusive laws on the horizontal axis, that the more inclusive laws are, the higher the level of GDP is. So there's clearly a very positive correlation. So these were laws related to sexual orientation, homosexuality in particular. If we did the same thing for transgender people, you would see a very similar positive correlation. More inclusion of trans people, higher GDP per capita. When we did a fancier test of this and took into account as many different factors as we could in thinking about what makes economies do well or not, we still found that having a higher level of inclusion raised GDP per capita. So this is a correlation. It's not necessarily a direct causation, but one additional right was associated with a $320 GDP per capita increase. So it was about 3% for these particular countries. Since then, we've actually studied this for a larger group of countries, and it continued to find increases in GDP per capita and more inclusive economies. We've seen this looking at different measures, and I'd be happy to talk more about that if you're interested in that. But basically, when we take this very high level view and connect it to that first view that I was talking about, where we're looking at the experience of LGBT people, it's very clear that LGBT people are going to do better and can contribute more to the economy that's visible, in a way that's visible in our larger figures. And that is the economic case for LGBT equality. So I will stop there, and I think, Emilio, you and I were going to have a chat about this.
Super. There. Yeah. You can see me? Perfect.
Yes.
Yes. So
did I stop sharing my screen? Would you like me to stop sharing?
Yeah, if you want.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Lee, for this incredible point of view and for sharing the main findings, not only from your book, but also from your experience doing research about the exclusion of LGBT plus community from every aspect of the society. I'd love to go a little bit deeper in this conversation before the rest of the audience. So I have a few questions from your last book, and then we can open the mic and the chat board for everyone, okay? Reading your book, in chapter 6, you address the struggle between the economic case and the economic world and the human rights activists, you know? Can we get along at the end, these two worlds, and talk the same language, or corporate world, do you think, does not speak the same language as human rights activism?
I think it's really important that we have that conversation. And so I'm glad that you raised that question. I see these two ways of thinking about the situation for LGBT people as being both being important and strengthening each other, really. I've had some people say, well, your argument is a human rights argument. It's just kind of putting dollar values on some of the human rights violations and adding those up. And so that is one way to think about it. But I think it's also important to think about how they support each other. So, for example, I think it's important to have a human rights argument because we wouldn't make an economic argument, I think, if for something that would actually violate people's human rights. You know, so if there was an economic argument for for slavery, for example. We wouldn't want to make that because it's a violation of human rights. But in this case, what we're talking about for the economic case is advancing human rights. So they support each other. On the other side, there are lots of, if you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you see lots of references to rights that are costly, that mean that societies have to devote resources for education of its people, for housing, for social security. These are all things that are much easier to do when you have an economy that is highly productive, that's a higher income country, right? So that there's more room to support those kinds of human rights arguments. So I think they really do go together, and I think we need to be making both of them at the same time.
That's good, but I mean, and you just said something about adding 1% of the GDP, and that's in chapter 5. You said that like countries with more rights, I mean LGBT rights, also have a higher GDP per capita than other countries with similar economic development, right? So how we can understand this, like with figures and numbers, and in this question for sure, where you put Singapore in this equation, because meaning Singapore is not at all LGBT friendly. However, they have a high GDP per capita.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, people have asked me that before, and I think that's a really excellent question. Well, let's just talk about Singapore to start with. I think one thing that's, Singapore does not have particularly good laws related to LGBT people. It is not a place that is considered to be inclusive. They still criminalize homosexuality. Very famously, a couple of years ago, they tried to kind of limit the sort of gay pride-like event there called the Pink Dot celebration by saying only Singaporeans can go, and only local companies, and no foreign companies can support it. And what happened was basically they many more people came than in past years, and many local companies stepped up and started supporting it. So it sort of backfired a little bit on the Singapore government in that sense. But what's also not so obvious is that in many ways Singapore has tried to at least verbally pull back a little bit on the sting of those laws, to say, well, we're not really going to discriminate. So there have been kind of public statements by public officials over the years that suggest that Singapore knows that people see that as being something that is not consistent in many ways with being sort of a modern, thriving trading partner, and so they want to at least send verbal signals that things aren't so bad. So they are kind of trying to have it both ways. So are they harmed by it? Well, the fact that they're saying something to soften the laws that exist suggests that maybe they do see some harm. Number one. Number two, what I think the research shows is that we're comparing it to the wrong thing. We shouldn't be comparing Singapore to other repressive countries, repressive for LGBT people, but we should be thinking about how much better they would be doing if they were to actually be more inclusive of LGBT people. And one thing that they may be better at doing is hanging on to their LGBT citizens who they've educated and want to keep access to that human capital. And to attract people from other countries. So it's entirely consistent with the idea that Singapore is losing out. They just don't realize it.
Absolutely. We're having here in the audience a lot of people from corporate world, from through LATAM. And LATAM businesses are starting right now the conversation about LGBT rights. So what should they do in the future after this? Involve, for example, in public policies as in the US, and why they should do that?
Well, I think, there are a lot of US companies involved in public policies, and I showed you some examples. But I think even in those companies, they're always thinking internally as well about what they can do for their own employees. So I think that for companies is really an important first step. And in my view, the best way to do that is to talk to your LGBT employees and to work with them. So if there are employee resource groups, you've got a ready audience of people to give you feedback about what's working and what's not. I think the other ways that employers can do this is through collecting more data on LGBT people. If you do engagement surveys, work-life balance surveys, or even in your HR system, many companies in the US, or IBM does this globally, they ask people if they want to self-identify as LGBT, so that the employer can make sure that they are connected with each other to help kind of create those connections, and also to make sure that all programs are inclusive of LGBT people. So just for example, at IBM, I know this because I did a case study recently on IBM Self-ID. They actually use that data to make sure that LGBT people are invited to professional development events, to apply for opportunities that they may be interested in to advance their careers. So, there's always a frontier, I think, in terms of what policies are. And the first ones, at the beginning, the non-discrimination policies, making sure benefits are equitable is very important, but kind of identifying these other ways to be more inclusive is important too. And eventually, I think the idea of speaking up publicly on LGBT issues is important. And I think the quote that I showed you shows an example of how public policies affect what companies can do. So that's an example. IBM in the United States has been a leader in pushing back against the kind of state laws like the one in North Carolina that I mentioned. There are global coalitions like Open for Business that exist to pull companies together so that they can speak with one voice, and maybe that's a little easier to do in certain kinds of situations. So there are many opportunities to learn from what other companies are doing and to work with other employers to advance inclusion of LGBT people.
Thank you, Lee. Now I'd love to read some questions from the audience. So again, either you can ask through the chat board or raising your hand on Zoom. So we have already some questions in here. Yeah, a lot of questions. The first is Eduardo. He said, hi, could we have the bibliographic reference from the consequence of discrimination at the workplace? I think you can find that on your book, right?
Yes, yeah. One of the things, the book has a lot of footnotes. so that's an easy way to find those out.
Okay, Eduardo, we're done with that. So Diego from Panama, hey Diego, which are the 8 variables type of laws that you consider from the graphics of correlation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the first attempt that we had to create a legal index, and my colleague Kees Waldijk, who's a Dutch legal scholar, had come up with this. That measures decriminalization, age of consent, and whether or not it's the same for same-sex sexual activity. It had measures of family policy. It had non-discrimination laws, both in the workplace and in the marketplace for goods and services. So there were 8 different laws that we tracked there. I will just say that we've tried other experiments, or not other experiments. We've tried the same exercise with different ways of measuring those laws and with different sets of laws. Found exactly the same correlation. We have also used a measure one of my colleagues created called the Global Acceptance Index. So it looks at public opinion data from all over the world over time, and we've used that. And all of these measures of acceptance or of inclusion measured as legal acceptance or of public opinion acceptance all show that same positive relationship to GDP.
Super. The next is from Germán Alonso. I don't know from where, but he said, hi, I would like to know how we can convince our governments to adopt non-discrimination policies or laws, obviously the human part and not that important for our authorities at this moment in LGBT rights. However, if they understand that there is an economic benefit, they may change their stand. Yeah.
I think that's a really important observation. I think that the advantage of the economic case is that it can open doors to have conversations to start with and to make them a little more pointed eventually about changing policies. But it can open those doors in places that are not really human rights oriented. So I'll just give you an example. I started working with this with the World Bank and with the US Agency for International Development. And I've spoken to a lot of the other development banks. And these aren't places, you know, many of them, you know, they think human rights are a good idea, but this is not what drives them. You know, the World Bank is a bank, but they are driven by something else. And so you have to put it in economic terms for them to be able to incorporate it into the work that they do. So I think that can also be true for government agencies that are, you know, the finance ministry or the agents, whatever ministry for economic development that countries might have in terms of public policy at that level can be very useful. I have personally, you know, briefed members of parliament in different countries about these issues. I have testified in the United States, spoken with businesses. All of these are places that are that seem to be very open to the economic arguments. And, you know, just as an example, in the marriage equality debate that's happened in many different countries, showing that that not only will letting same-sex couples marry not hurt anybody, doesn't hurt the institution of marriage, it actually is good for lots of local businesses, because when people get married, they spend a lot of money in many places. And so, you know, more marriages means more businesses more business for, you know, small employers like florists and hotels and restaurants. So those kinds of arguments, I think, you know, really strategically kind of serve lots of purposes. It increases the number of people who might want to listen. And it gets us away from thinking about some of the arguments that might be, you know, rooted in more sort of moral or religious beliefs that are hard to kind of counter sometimes. So I think that that's the value of the economic argument. It just makes us look at things in a very different kind of way.
Super. This one is from Matias Puente in Chile. Very inspiring conversation. I was shocked by the information about bullying at school. I was not that conscious of that situation. What advice can you give to those parents with LGBT children, and what is the best way to cope with those situations?
Those are excellent questions. I feel a little underprepared to answer them as an economist, but I can tell you that you know, many times there'll be local organizations for LGBT young people and students who have thought a lot about this and can provide support to parents and to the young LGBT people themselves. There is some evidence in the United States that that parents make a huge difference in terms of how their LGBT young people, their LGBT children, you know, process their experiences and those outcomes. You know, as I, for example, mentioned the, you know, very horrendous statistics related to suicidal attempts and suicidal thinking, for example. And Caitlin Ryan is a psychologist in the US who has created what she calls the Family Acceptance Project. And it's about building the relationships between young LGBT people and their parents so that the parents are supportive. And when parents are supportive, all those bad outcomes are much less likely to happen, even when the kids are facing the same kinds of challenges in the schools. So those are just a couple of examples that come to mind. But I think, you know, finding those local resources is very important.
Super, thank you. We have a lot of questions, Lee. So
Great.
This is from Daniel Serrano. What is the overview in general? Is it getting better for LGBT people in LATAM regarding job conditions, yes, and acceptance? Which countries, in your opinion, have progressed more in the last few years?
Okay, that's a very good question. My friend and colleague Javier Corrales, who teaches at Amherst College nearby, has written quite a bit about this and has shown, some of the factors that have led to improvements in public policies for LGBT people in Latin America, but also has documented the backlash in some places that's come sometimes from governments, sometimes from the strength of more traditional religious believers, faith communities. So there's a little bit of a mixed bag, but overall, at least in terms of public policy, the trends are very strong and have been excellent in South America in particular. I think the other question that I hear in your question is really about how LGBT people's lives have changed. And that is actually a much harder thing to know. Public policies are important, but how effective are they? That's always hard to know. With marriage equality, we can see how many people get married, but with non-discrimination policies, it's hard to track those differences. So one of the things that I've been involved with over the last few years is trying to create what's called the LGBTI inclusion index. So that I is to add intersex people to LGBT people. And it's an effort that's being run by the United Nations Development Program, where they want to create a measure about how well countries are doing. So we can compare countries and track changes over time, and include not just information about laws, which are important, but also about the lived experience of LGBT people. How many are poor? Are they experiencing discrimination? What kinds of health disparities do we see? What are the levels of education they're able to achieve? So I think to really answer your question, it's going to take a lot more data to kind of follow up. So the laws are kind of a proxy, I would say, and they're opening up some space, but how much space is opened up is hard to know.
Super. The next question from Pilar Rojas. This is a really, really good one. Thanks for the presentation, Lee. And in the study, was anything related to the relationship of discrimination and the decision to migrate of LGBTI, sorry, was mixed people?
It's a great question, and I think it's totally reasonable to predict that people will want to leave places that are less favorable and go to more accepting places. But we don't have data on that. We have some anecdotal data. There have been a few studies that have surveyed LGBT people and asked them about whether they're thinking about moving, so it does. It's seems likely, but right now we don't really have a particularly strong evidence base for that. But it is likely to make a difference if the brain drain argument is something that's real for many countries, and hanging on to the people that you've spent a lot of money to train and educate, is something that's very important for economies. So I think if we could measure it, it would probably add to that 1% loss figure.
Thank you. This one is from Ecuador, from Emilio. Hey, Emilio. How should Latin companies, especially from Ecuador, how they can do to approach to guarantee this good treatment of LGBT employees without this fighting inside the companies about internal clients, for example, or internal fundamentalism? I guess this recipe is for any company, right?
Yeah. I think, this is not an uncommon concern. Well, I think one thing is, this is where the business case can make a difference. I think you can say that we have to do this in order to have our employees be at their best, to be their most productive, to make sure we're hiring the best people and hanging on to them. And I think that goes a long way towards making it a discussion about a business decision, and not making it a discussion about kind of a social policy decision, for example, or something. Anyway, so that it's an opportunity to explain action in that way, and the need, and to say, to people whose beliefs take them in a different direction to say, you're entitled to your beliefs, but this is, while you're in the workplace, we need to be more respectful. We need to treat people equally and inclusively. So I think that's, that's very important. Companies do trainings to try to achieve this. So that, is one way to try to educate employees about who LGBT people are, because there are many stereotypes about LGBT people still that are just not founded in fact, and sometimes dispelling those stereotypes makes a difference. So I think having those kinds of conversations has been important. I mean, in the U.S., many companies went through those same kinds of concerns and considerations, and having conversations sometimes doesn't just change policy, but it can change the minds of other people who work there. So it is possible to make it all fit in some kinds of ways. And I imagine that's something that Pride Connection groups have dealt with. Have you guys talked about that issue, Emilio?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is part of their recipes, I guess. And you said it's about respect. It's not about to impose anything. It's about to respect each other in the organization or any business. We have another question from Colombia, from a Brazilian girl, from a Brazilian person. Okay, hi, my name is Ronnie from Beach Ride App, Colombia. I'm Brazilian, currently living in Colombia. Okay, the question is how to pop out the bubble, how to make non-LGBTQ plus people understand the importance of inclusion or equality in contrast with conservative ideals, so we can walk towards better work environments to queer people. I mean, it's more or less the same, the arguments for non-LGBTQ people.
Yeah, I think there's at least a couple of ways that that's going to happen. I mean, some of it happens from the very high level, changing public policies, which send a message to people. And actually, there have been some studies that show that in places that have enacted marriage equality or other LGBT positive policies, that people's opinions change. The laws themselves are kind of establish a new kind of social norm that makes people change how they think about LGBT people. The other way, again, kind of from the bottom up, is thinking about what LGBT people, spend at least some time doing, often at least at some parts of their lives, which is telling their stories to their coworkers, telling their stories to family members, people who need to understand, what it's really like to be an LGBT person, that it's not about, the stereotypes. It's really about trying to figure out how to navigate a world that has many challenges, and talking about what those consequences are can be very meaningful for people. There are lots and lots of studies that show that people who know someone else who's LGBT, and in particular who've had some meaningful interaction with those people, are more likely to have very positive attitudes towards LGBT people. So I think it kind of has to come from the top. It's got to build up from the bottom, and over time, that's what will move the needle, I think.
Okay, so I have another one from Daniela Santana from Chile. Hi, thanks a lot for the webinar. What about public sector? In the strict sense, public servant must comply with human rights, given that we are the state. But it seems like it's even harder to mainstream LGBTIQ plus issues, and it also seems it's harder to sell the idea of an economic cost to the state. Any thoughts on that?
Right. So the public sector may not care as much about profits, for example, but they do have to recruit and retain employees. So many of those same kinds of costs will be higher for the public sector, even if you're not kind of, seeing an increase in kind of net profits as a result. You're actually going to be raising your costs if you're not looking at these issues and trying to make your workplaces more inclusive. I think, the public sector sometimes has some particular challenges depending on the country, because criminalization of homosexuality or of being transgender can actually be a barrier. We certainly saw that in the United States. Canada even sees this, but so many countries have kind of gone through that phase of seeing homosexuality as a sickness, as a mental health disorder, as something to be kind of pushed out by the public sector. But maybe the best example of why that's harmful is comes from Justin Trudeau's apology to the LGBT community a few years ago for the public sector's policies of sometimes hounding LGBT people out of jobs or out of the military, and pointing out that, how harmful this was to those people, but also how harmful it was to the public sector, that Canada lost the value of those people being pushed out, and prevented other people who had much to offer public service from coming in. So we want our public servants to be well-trained employees who are talented and skilled. I teach in a public policy program where that's exactly what we're trying to do, to train public servants who will be excellent in their job. So I think many of those same kinds of public service concerns for HR will be there. And the last thing I will say, though, is that also the public sector should be more accountable to public sentiment, right? So that's a situation, that I know is complicated across countries, but at least public sector rules and regulations, the laws that govern public service, are things that can be changed through political means, as opposed to a company which has to do it mostly on its own. So I think there are actually some extra tools that you have in the public sector that you don't have in the private sector.
Thank you. This from Juan Chavez. Do you think there is a correlation in discrimination or punishment in wages or labor opportunities in older generations rather than younger generations? I think it's LGBT generations, I think.
Yeah, that is such a great question. And I have a colleague in the US, Elon Meyer, who has actually kind of been studying different cohorts of people, and they do have very different experiences. Younger LGBT people compared to older ones, come out much earlier, for example. So, that actually could just be a measure that they feel more openness, or it could mean that they're going to face stigma and discrimination more quickly. It's hard to know exactly. So he hasn't yet kind of looked at that in terms of like the economic outcomes. But I do think there are likely to be some big cohort differences, but it gets very complicated to figure out, what that means. If the older cohorts waited a long time, before coming out in the workplace until their careers were well established, we might see them doing relatively well compared to younger cohorts who come out earlier. I think it's a little bit hard to predict because there are a lot of moving parts, but it's a wonderful question.
Super. The other one is from Luis. This is a really good one. Like, what is your opinion about job vacancy for LGBT? Like a reserved space or or share from the new for a new reserved space for LGBT people or LGBT workers. What do you think about that?
It is an interesting question. I think it probably depends on the context that we're talking about, whether a country has that as a tradition of providing a boost for groups that need it, that have traditionally faced stigma and discrimination. I mean, in the US, we've had such programs, we call them affirmative action, for racial minorities and sometimes for women. And they have usually not been jobs that are reserved for people, but they've just been more, trying to push companies to try harder to hire them. So, I'm very interested in this question because my current research project is more or less exactly on this. I'm looking at how do we create economic opportunities for low income LGBT people in particular, and I think, you know, what I've seen in looking at a bunch of different countries is that you know, often the people who have the hardest time getting into jobs, and who I think there's a very strong case for thinking about programs like this, would be transgender people. They in the US, where we have pretty good research on poverty, they have the highest poverty levels. In the US, 29% of people who identify as transgender live below our poverty level. And that's before the COVID crisis. And you know, so there's evidence in many other countries that transgender people just have a particularly hard time. So I think if you're going to think about that, I would start off by identifying the groups that are farthest away from the kinds of opportunities we want to have. So it's not exactly a yes or no question or answer, I know, but I think those are the things that I would think about before kind of saying, yes, let's go forward with something like that.
Super. We have a lot of questions. We're running out of time, but keep going. This is from Camila Galdames from Chile. How do you think the data is affected when you consider, when you put queer people who are also part of this minority group, you know, some minority inside another minority? It is affected, your data with queer people? It is included?
That's a great question. We could talk all day about data. I love it. I love it. So we have lots of debates amongst my friends and colleagues and who study this stuff about, you know, how should we think about queer people? Are they already there? And I think I kind of think they're already there. I think, you know, crafting survey questions is harder than it looks, because especially now, we have so many different terms for identities. And so my guess is that people who think of themselves as queer, who see a question that says, are you heterosexual or straight? Or are you lesbian or gay? Or are you bisexual? Or are you something else? That most of them are going to choose lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and maybe something else. So I think we are seeing them in there. But in the US, what little data I've seen suggests that people who identify as queer are actually pretty highly educated. So they are going to just be in kind of a better position to start with because of that. But I haven't seen any really strong research that kind of looks at whether queer people differ in some way. Okay,
that's good. Another question, and it's really related with education. This is from Cristobal Otero. I'd like to ask Lee the following question. What are the implications of your findings on different higher education systems? Is LGBT inclusion being included in different curricula in order to provide countries with a more inclusive working force?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's pretty rare. I mean, if you think about what should we be doing in the education sector and say the higher education sector, there still can be that sort of harassment and discrimination that happens in workplaces and schools at other levels. So I think addressing that is very important. And there has been a fair amount of attention to that and of building supports for LGBT students maybe through offices or community centers on campuses to support LGBT students. But the curricular issues are challenging because I think that it's still pretty rare in my experience. I think a lot of the coursework that I see on my campus and the others that we work with locally is in the humanities. So it might be related to literature, for example, or history. There's very little in economics, for example, very little. Actually, I'm teaching a class in LGBT economics and public policy this coming term, starting on Monday, actually. And I tell them, you can't get this class anywhere else. It just doesn't exist, you know, so it's very, very rare. And it means that we're not reaching LGBT young people to kind of give them some knowledge that they might be able to use. A lot of my students are not LGBT, so I'm very encouraged by that. They want to learn, they want to be supportive, but we need more of it. Absolutely, we need more of it.
Okay. This one is from Jairo Duarte from Colombia. Colombia is one of the most inclusive countries in the Latin region, and the companies are working more to be inclusive, but sometimes looks like a poker face society when you mix LGBT, employment, and religion. How it is possible to be more inclusive in a religious society? That's a good question, though.
It is. It's another good question. And again, it's a little bit outside of my own realm of knowledge and experience, but I'll just say that there's a lot of variation, right? So, I mean, Ireland, for example, is a very Catholic country. People are very religious, and yet a marriage equality referendum, they had to vote on it to put it into the Constitution. And people were very worried about what would happen, and it passed overwhelmingly. So I think, you know, in the United States, we've had it's kind of a complicated legal landscape, but like 22 states have passed laws that ban discrimination against LGBT people, and one of the most recent ones was Utah, which is a heavily Mormon state. And there was a lot of work within, I think, groups, activist groups, to try to translate the importance of LGBT inclusion into terms that people in that religious tradition could hear. And a lot of it had to do with families, supporting family members and being supportive. And that's something that I think, you know, it's a strategic element to kind of think through how that can work. And sometimes it's going around the church, as in Ireland's case, and sometimes it's going right through it. So I think kind of figuring that out is really the key. And I'm sorry I don't have a roadmap for you on that, but I think it is possible.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Osvaldo. He's a public servant. Hey, thanks for the webinar and for such a great panelist. In my opinion, governments can lead by the example and can push boundaries. As a civil servant, every time I heard about this topic, discrimination and impact on the economy, I keep wondering if there is any information, research, or examples about the public sector. There is any? I mean, yeah, that kind of comes back to the earlier question, I think. Okay. And but I think that point about the public sector being an important example and role model is really key, and it is a reason to push the public sector for sure. And I think, you know, again, that public accountability is a tool that you don't have in the private sector, so that's very positive. Well, I can tell you that in the United States, after, you know, some pressure, some questions were added to the survey that's done of federal employees every year. And, you know, the news is not good. There's a lot of dissatisfaction amongst LGBT people, and more so than for non-LGBT people. So, but, you know, I think documenting things like that and tying it to the nonprofit, you know, the public sector business case, which is about lowering costs and improving service, is a way potentially to do that. Mm-hmm. Well, a few more questions because of the time. This is from Camila Pizarro. I recently saw that a federal judge blocked Trump's administration's anti-trans healthcare rule, you know. Even though I'm glad it was blocked, it worries me that it's so easy to someone to declare such an irrational rule. What actions could be done to reinforce the support of a basic human right if we see a constant setback?
Yes, well, we're thinking a lot about that in the United States right now. It's an election year, and we'll see what happens. I think the interesting thing that's happened is, well, we go back to President Obama and his administration. he took a lot of executive actions to try to increase opportunities for the LGBT population in the U.S. And there's always a risk to that, which is that they'll be overturned by the next president or by courts if they're challenged. And that's kind of exactly what President Trump is finding, is that when he tries to take away rights that that people value and need, that there will be challenges. And, you know, once that happens, then the federal government has to really clearly articulate a good reason for doing, for taking those actions in the United States. And it's not considered a good reason to say that we don't like trans people or we don't like LGBT people. So that's a principle that's been very clearly articulated. And there have been, you know, there was a recent ruling that really led to a lot of progress regarding employment discrimination for LGBT people. That is now illegal because it's considered sex discrimination, which is already illegal. And so we did need Congress to pass that law to change that piece of non-discrimination law. Anyway, I guess to make a long story short, I think the political back and forth is that, you know, one party tries to take a right away and the other party is going to challenge it. Right now in the US, we have some good tools to try to stop that through these earlier court decisions. And so that's, you know, made a difference. And sometimes politically, the Trump administration, for example, tried to take some questions off of surveys related to LGBT people. And there was an outcry and they put them back, you know, so sometimes they have responded to political pressure. But I think, you know, just mobilizing the strengths of our political systems in terms of, you know, kind of how do you express concerns about human rights? So you do it through elections, do it through challenging things in court. As long as those tools are there, you know, there's at least an opportunity to fight back when rights are taken away.
Okay, maybe the last question. This is from Nicolas Cepeda. What do you think about the call pink washing of some companies or businesses? I would like to know your view or point of view on how to address the LGBT case, or the economic case, as the right thing to do, and not only for marketing, for example.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so pink washing can mean kind of different sorts of things, but let's just say, you know, sort of an insincere statement on the part of companies to try to, you know, look good when they're actually not, when they're not actually walking their talk within the company. I think that's important. And I think that's where LGBT, both internal organizations within the company, maybe a little harder, but sort of external organizations can point out those contradictions to say, well, yes, you say you have these policies, but you don't have these other policies. Or you say you are taking these actions, but in fact, we have examples of discrimination. I think that kind of accountability is very important. One way to increase that accountability is to track it, you know, to actually document what companies are doing. And there are these indexes all over the world. There's one in Chile now, right? And there's one in Mexico, there's one in the US, there's one in Hong Kong. I mean, they're all over in the UK. There, many different countries have them to actually ask employers to go on the record with what their policies and positions are on these LGBT issues, and to, you know, to hold them accountable. And that's, you know, that kind of sunlight, I think, is the best weapon against the pink washing phenomenon.
Super, that's a good answer. And the last question for today from Laura from Dominican Republic. I think there is a lot of people outside the community, the LGBT community, that believe in LGBT rights, but also think it is problematic to take a stand in the corporation or within a company. How can we convince people that promoting LGBT rights is not problematic?
I think you tie it to the business case. I think that's, if you're talking about what people's actions are inside their place of employment, and you can say, this is a business decision that you're making, or by not making a decision, by not making a change, you are actually, you know, sort of putting the business in a worse position. I think that that's the value of the business case, that it's not about your personal beliefs. It's not about, you know, anybody's religion. It's about the health of our employer. And that's about, you know, kind of keeping everybody's jobs, keeping everybody's, keeping the company healthy, and doing well by doing good, you know, in terms of treating LGBT people inclusively.
Super. So I know many of you will love to stay longer and keep picking Lee's brain. She has been incredible. So on behalf of Pride Connection, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. If you want to learn more about her research, don't forget to read her book, The Economic Case for LGBT Equality and Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits All of Us. Lee, again, and again, thank you so much. It was a blast.
Thank you, Emilio. I really enjoyed it. These were fantastic questions. I could talk all day about these. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Y bueno, para todos ustedes, muchas gracias por haberse conectado. Quienes quieran repasar este webinar, lo enviaremos durante el día por correo electrónico para todos los que se inscribieron. Nuevamente, agradecer a cada coordinador y coordinadora de la red Pride Connection en cada país de América Latina y, por supuesto, a cada aliado y aliada en el mundo corporativo. Si tu empresa no está en Pride Connection o no lo está en uno de los capítulos de la red en cualquier país de América Latina, por supuesto que los invito a unirse. Ustedes, cada uno de ustedes, puede hacer el cambio y hacer que su empresa, su organización y su economía sea mucho más próspera. Me despido y será hasta la próxima. Chao, chao.
All right, you.